Chapter 26. Ritual. Fleet's run to catch up with her tribe set out at dawn at her insistence. She was significantly slowed by the pace of the three young men from the folk who accompanied her. Nrrk had, as was now obvious to Fleet, a full-fledged mate lust for her, and there was no way he'd allow her to leave the folk without him. He had chosen two of the faster young men to be in the running group. None of them could match Fleet's swift pace, but they had excellent stamina, and kept up their jog with enough wind left over to chant their strange, to Fleet, traveling song. She ran ahead of the trio until she was too far ahead, according to Nrrk, who had let out a powerful woofing sound, with carrying power, which meant with great clarity, too far. She could always hear it, even with the sound of the surf, and would immediately reverse course and run back to the men. Her loyalty to the folk had developed very quickly, especially to Nrrk, who had, after all, saved her from a knife tooth, and he smelled particularly delicious among the dream smells of the folk in general. It took her almost a day of circling back around the folk runners to decide what their chant meant. In a late-day flash of insight, she realized it meant, "We run because we cannot fly." She parsed it as she made her next loop. Returning, she slowed her long lope to match the young folks' pace. Then she tried, "Fleet cannot fly," wishing she knew their way of saying also. Then she hurtled ahead, leaping with every step higher than most people, all folk, could leap. She flapped her arms, clearly trying to fly. She heard the guttural woof of the folk laugh from all three. She ran on ahead, still taking leaping steps, tireless. Fleet found Spirit Woman floating in a shallow bed of seaweed. The white and nibbled body would be sunk if it were not for the buoyancy of the greenery beneath her. Fleet was confused and moved. Here was a woman she knew, a tortured, brilliant, and creative woman, dead beyond denial, and the tribe was nowhere around. Close, she believed, but not attending to Spirit Woman in her departure from the here to the there of the endless sleep. The tribe burned their dead. The pyre was the last privilege of tribe membership. The fires went long, and the bones were as much ash as the hair when a tribe cremation was done. Never a feast for the beasts, for tribespersons, but no pyre for Spirit Woman. Why? What could explain this? Stopping, she looked back at her traveling companions, almost a full loop back. She had a few moments to contemplate. Would the young males conclude that the tribe had disposed of one of their own with no ceremony? Fleet's short stay with the folk had shown her they attached at least as much importance to properly sending the deceased on to the next world as did the tribe. An elderly male had taken that last journey on the third day of her time in the cave home, and much had been made of the event. The old man may have been a leader of the folk in his younger days, for he was buried with a well-crafted spear. Several of the young men dug a substantial hole in the floor in the rearmost portion of the cave, and there had been much cracking of stones as they shaped the grave. There was a ritual which Fleet had not been allowed to closely observe or participate in. She looked back again, then made her decision. There would be a pyre for Spirit Woman. By the time the young men finally jogged up to Fleet, she had started construction of the platform. She dragged driftwood logs that were also caught in the seaweed, and aligned them as the base of what would become the funeral stack. Since they were wet, they would last longest, holding things in place until Spirit Woman was consumed. She dragged the body onto the dry sand and rolled it on its back, crossing Spirit Woman's hands on her chest. Her defiled face she covered with kelp leaves. The young men stopped short of where Fleet was making the preparations, looking with a mix of confusion and perhaps fear at the body. Fleet did not hesitate for a second, leaping in front of the men and making what had become her favorite folk gesture, hands up, palms out, waving slowly in front of the three young male faces, then bringing her hands to her face as though pulling them to her eyes. This meant, "Listen to me." They reluctantly pulled their eyes from the body and attended Fleet fully. She reached out and held the shoulder of Nrrk. made a short gesture and unique sound that meant fire. Whereas in the home cave the fire was never allowed to go out, she knew Nrrk was a competent firemaker, having seen his work on hunting nights. She held his gaze for a few heartbeats until she saw his agreement. She gently pushed his shoulder to send him to the task, then placed one hand on the shoulder of each of the other two men. As usual, she had to improvise a bit to compensate for her incomplete mastery of folk language, but shortly she had both of them jogging up into the woods from the beach and back, gathering firewood of specified size and quality. She set to constructing the spirit woman's pyre in the ways of the tribe. The sun moved close to the line of the world as they finished. The construction was impressively large, with the platform for the body almost as high as she could reach, and a great deal of dead wood stacked in crisscross patterns, leaving air paths from the bottom to the top, and the whole thing tapered and balanced to hold its shape long into the burn. Fleet waded into the seaweed lagoon and picked many large leaves. She instructed the men to tuck them under and around Spirit Woman's body before the four of them picked up the sea-decayed form and hefted it upon the pyre. When the body was in place, Fleet finalized the seaweed encasement. Then she stood astraddle Spirit Woman's hips and began the death song of the tribe. It was the first time she had sung the service, but she had seen and heard it since she was an infant and knew every word and gesture. The service was as long as a hand-width of movement of the sun or moon. The three young folk-men stood in silence, and one could sense their amazement, watching the tall young female frail making sounds and gestures, reaching for the sky and swaying like a tree in a powerful wind, unlike anything they had witnessed before. Nrrk had labored to create a small but stable fire near the base of the pyre, feeding it gradually larger pieces of deadwood to keep it going. When Fleet suddenly stopped her strange behavior atop the cleverly stacked wood and froze her movement, he was well briefed by her that was the time to move the small burning pile between the base logs and build it quickly with an addition of many small dry twigs and bundles of salt grass. The pyre ignited quickly and evenly. The flames flashed up through the larger logs crisscrossed to form the pyramid. When the first licks of flame reached the top, Fleet seemed to fly away from her perch and leap a quite amazing distance in the minds of the folk men. She hit the beach and was running instantly in a loop around the pyre. On her third circle, she stopped in front of the young men and stood in front of them. None of them knew what was expected of him, so all three stood unmoving, looking into the smoldering eyes of the thin black woman, her skin shining with fire-lit sweat. Their daydream minds saw exactly what was happening. The dead frail was being honored, and all three approved, but they could not see what she expected of them. Irritated, Fleet pantomimed for them to follow her. They did, as she made a much slower circuit around the growing flames of the pyre, the three folk following her at a jog. This act of ritual satisfied Fleet's urge to involve the young men in the tribe's tradition for wishing the past a good journey. She collapsed into the sand and let her tears flow. The men politely released their own tears, easy for their empathetic race. A full day's journey toward the sunset away, Mother of Six saw the glow of the pyre toward the sunrise direction, and let out a wail, pointing so that all the tribe looked. Leader Wise made one of her intuitive leaps. Right so often they were held in reverence by the tribe. She pointed to the glow on the horizon and said, "Spirit Woman is joining the invisible tribe." A soft ah swept through the tribe. True or not, it felt right. The fire glow was from a single point, not the wide glare of distant fire in the forest or the brush, and it was a powerfully comforting thought. During the day's walk along the beach there had been much discussion of the jeopardy of an unconsecrated death. To leave a member of the tribe to the ravages of wild beasts, with no place to sleep the endless sleep, would bring no good, perhaps bad fortune, perhaps worse. Wise's words cleared the fog of anxiety. Wide Shoulders wanted it to be true as much as anyone, but he wondered how could it be? Did Spirit Woman survive long enough to build her own pyre? Were there spirit powers involved? These questions had no answers that satisfied him. The pyre burned late into the night. Fleet and Nrrk sat alone through most of the process of reducing Spirit Woman's body to complete ash, adding logs when the fire diminished. She softly intoned the tribe's songs and incantations for the final service. The men went hunting for dinner. When they returned, they did not seem concerned that Fleet would not let them roast the 2 pigs they had killed on the funeral fire. She made a small concession and allowed them to take a firebrand to start the cooking fire rather than starting it from scratch. As dawn announced the end of night, the sweet smell of roasting pork put an ironic twist to the ritual, and was seen with appreciation in the daydream minds of the folk, and with a vague feeling of disquiet by Fleet. The men were eager to find a camping site in the forest. They had been afoot for a day and a night, and clearly needed rest. Fleet did not recognize her own exhaustion, but the ritual for Spirit Woman had drained her. As her expectation and growing excitement about finding the tribe and making the case for an alliance with the folk had been building, this strange interruption of her journey totally depleted her reserves. She went to sleep by the fires, holding a bone with unfinished meat. Nrrk carried her to the sheltered grove where the men had made sleeping hollows in the soft earth. She slept the full day, mostly with her head on Nrrk's chest.